the memorial we celebrate, the presentation of the Blessed Virgin Mary in the temple, is not something that is found in Scripture directly. And actually, the church doesn't necessarily base the celebration of this memorial from a biblical standpoint directly, like it does in other teachings about Our Lady. However, this idea of Mary being presented in the temple does not go against Scripture. And actually, if you consider that which we find in Scripture, which is Mary is the mother of Jesus, she gave birth to him, it does make sense within that context. Meaning that, in the book of Revelation, it says there that nothing unclean will enter into heaven or can enter into heaven. So that's kind of like a foundational passage, or it points us to the purity of a soul, that it's the purity that a soul needs to be able to go into heaven. But it also kind of makes sense to think of the purity of a soul for heaven to come down and reside in a person's heart, specifically in an incarnational way. And so this then makes sense, as God had foreordained Mary to be the mother of his Son, the second person of the Trinity from all eternity. It makes sense that she would be a pure vessel to receive him in such a manner. And indeed, that's what the Immaculate Conception is about, conceived without sin. But also this feast day kind of flows along with that. In other words, the preparation for Mary to be the mother of God didn't it just wasn't like a one-time event with the Immaculate Conception. It was that, but then it was also the initial years of her life as a baby, as a child, as a young girl, an adolescent, as a teenage girl. All those years were in preparation for her to receive the Word made flesh. In other words, to keep her undefiled, if you will. And so tradition has it that Joachim and Anne were a barren couple, and they prayed to the Lord for a child, just like Hannah did back in the Old Testament with Samuel. And just as Hannah, when she conceived Samuel, dedicated him to the Lord, gave him back to the Lord, so Joachim and Anne, inspired by God's grace and generosity by giving them a child, they decided to give her back to the Lord and dedicate her in the temple. Because in the Old Testament temple in Jerusalem, they would take these young girls as young virgins, and they would live in the temple from the ages of about 3 to 12 years old. And so Joachim and Anne, having conceived Our Lady, given birth to her, and also recognizing, I'm sure, her special holiness, they traveled from Nazareth down to Jerusalem and gave her to the temple. And the beautiful thing is that we get this in tradition from this writing called the Proto-Evangelium of James. It was a book that was written in the early church, and it details this history. And it says in this writing that when they presented her in the temple, she did not run back to her parents. Rather, she danced. That's what it says. She danced. And again, this makes sense because the Mother of God, who was created without sin, who was created in a fullness of grace, had a heart that was so oriented to the Lord that there was no resistance to her being dedicated to the Lord and presented to the Lord in the temple, and for her to live in the temple in this way. Because that's the air she breathed. That's what it means to be fullness of grace. We can't appreciate it because we are bogged down by sin, and our hearts are more oriented to straying from God and turning away from him than going towards him. But Our Lady's heart was oriented towards running towards him, and that's why being and living in the temple would make sense, because that was her home. And that time in the temple was a time of formation for her and preparation for her if you will, a time of Advent that allowed her to prepare unknowingly, but still to prepare for that moment when the angel Gabriel would visit her. So today, may we rejoice in this feast, a feast of the presentation, and recognize that in it, it is truly her response to God's gift to her in the Immaculate Conception. It was Mary's yes, Mary's free will, even at a very young age. Even at a very young age, her yes that says, God says, I consecrate you, and Mary says, yes, I give myself back to you. God gave her a gift. God gifted her in grace, and Our Lady, the presentation is her response, her yes, the beginning of her continual yes to God in her life, culminating at the Annunciation, culminating at Calvary. May we today ponder this, and may we recognize in this our own baptismal consecration, and may we be inspired by Our Lady's gift to God to try to give our yes, a more perfect yes to the Lord, in a more pure and perfect way in this life.